So if we were to start to construct a blueprint now for that athlete who is 5 to 7 kilograms overweight, to fuel properly so they're not doing that damage we've identified, where they're not compromising immunity, they're not starting to build inflammation, stressors from underfueling on the bike, but they were starting to create a deficit off the bike. What does that blueprint start to look like?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing, going back to your knowledge and, like you said, misinformation that's out there, you do have that, say, Dunning-Kruger effect where, people know some and then they think that they know more than they know. And actually, the more you know, the less you know. You realize the less you know.
I've had that on the podcast quite a bit.
I think, look, I think that's the way we should all be thinking, and I think people who do have knowledge or information, really what that should empower people to do is ask the right question or ask a better question. So just because you've learned something, or let's say we're talking about an energy deficit. So I want to improve my body composition. I'm deliberately looking to reduce my calorie intake. And I know that being in a deficit is going to help me get there. So let's say that's knowledge. Now, how you can use that information is to ask a better question, to say, when is it appropriate for me to reduce my intake without compromising my performance on the bike? Now that knowledge has helped facilitate a better question, and you can say, okay, well, I'll go back to knowledge. I know I need to fuel this much before this session because this is the cost of it. But actually, I have nothing on it the rest of the day, and then I'm going into a rest day. So I'm better off starting to move my deficit towards that period of time and then into the next day as well. So knowledge should facilitate better questions that allow people to navigate towards building out what we would come back to and say, it's just like training. Your nutrition should be periodized. You should be increasing and decreasing your carbohydrate and energy intake in line with the demands of your activity. And during those periods of less intense, lower duration, or periods of complete rest, they're completely appropriate times to start to reduce that intake, working towards those deficits. But during those periods where you're really trying to perform, you want to practice what it's going to be like at a race, they're the times it's better to go back to that energy balance and say, well, I'm going to focus on delivering a performance here. It's more appropriate there and less appropriate.
This is really
here.
good. I love this angle, Dave. So I spoke to Dan Lorang, head of performance at Bora, and he had this idea of, before someone starts thinking about, I'm going to peak for this race, pull out your Google Calendar and now put in the stuff that's a big stress in your life. So what day are you getting married? What day is your son due to be born on? Put in these big stressors that are immovable in your life. And now let's start thinking about building your training plan around this, because we can't get an adaptation to training in the presence of high stress outside of training. So I'd nearly say, based on what you're saying there, we could layer a second layer on this Dan calendar idea and start to lay in periods and identify periods in the week and in the day where we should be high carbohydrate, where we should be medium carbohydrate, and periods where we can start to think about a calorie deficit. So a calorie deficit doesn't become a 24/7 obsession. It's just these periods we can start to think about calorie deficits, because it's appropriate to think about them there.
100%. And exactly like you said, if you look at that training calendar, Dan's obviously done a phenomenal job in all the roles and athletes he's supported. It is going to be periodized throughout the course of the year. There are going to be periods of higher volume, lower volume, days of higher volume, lower volume, days of complete rest, days, like you said, that are travel days, family stress, and going back to what we said, nutrition is a training tool. It is there to support that work and amplify what your body can do and how it responds to it. So I think you have to think of both in conjunction. I'd have a fundamental belief. You cannot make an accurate nutritional recommendation until you understand somebody's training. Only then can you start to say, well, because they have this on this day, it's at this, like we said before, type, intensity, duration of the activity. This is how much time they have available to recover. This is when they're preparing to go next. Now we can go, based on all of this, we can quantify what is the most appropriate thing when we should be ramping up and pulling down the energy, the carbohydrate intake, while still evenly distributing protein to maintain, protect, and enhance the lean mass that they have.
Is it only carbohydrate that's getting periodized throughout the week? Is protein staying a consistent recommendation day to day?
So it's not just carbohydrate. It's going to be carbohydrate and energy will be big ones that we'll see. They'll be the two most dramatic that will adjust.
Okay.
And that really comes back to the fact that when we're exercising, carbohydrate is going to be our primary fuel source. But as you said, when we look at protein, protein is something that we want to maintain on a consistent basis. For most people listening, around 1.6 to say 2.4 grams per kilogram of their body weight, let's call it an average of 2 grams per kilo, is enough to maintain,
and that's a lot of
enhance
protein. When you start thinking like chicken breast, 30 grams of protein, and like I'm 80 kilograms, so I'm looking at 160 grams of protein a day, and a chicken breast is 30 grams of protein roughly. You're like, you need to be thinking about your meals in advance. They can't be just, I'll bang on a bit of pasta here.
No, 100%. I would say there's really low hanging fruit for everyone for this. So most people will consume a decent amount of protein in lunch and dinner. They're like typical behaviors that we see in society. I think more people are becoming more aware at breakfast, where they're consuming, let's say, some eggs. They're adding in some Greek yogurt on top of
Since
muesli.
using Hexus, I started banging 2 scoops of protein powder into my porridge in the morning, because I was like, I've eaten oats forever in the morning. I was like, I can't have a 0 protein meal because it just puts too much pressure on the rest of the day.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Really what you're trying to do is evenly distribute it as best as possible throughout the course of the day. And I think, like you've said there, I think most people listening to this, I would say, look at your breakfast and look at your snacks. They're the opportunities for most people to increase or elevate their protein intake. And all of a sudden what you'll start to see is recovery can start to improve. Things like muscle soreness starts to dampen, and those adaptations that we're trying to facilitate start to improve. And a simple snack could be, maybe you're getting ready for training and you wanted some granola or Bircher's muesli before, but add in 2-3 tablespoons of Greek yogurt. Or are you actually having a recovery snack or drink when you get off the bike before you go and eat your meal? Maybe it's as simple as bolting in something there and saying, well, let's have an additional meal, and let's call it a smoothie, whatever it might be, where you might use some whey or whatever protein powder you prefer, or some Greek yogurt and dairy, and start to pull together a good recovery drink that's not just high in protein, that will help remodel that muscle, but also provide other nutrients to aid that recovery process.
So while we're on that, recovery drinks, for a long time, the dominant narrative I heard is recovery drinks should be 4-to-1 carbohydrates to protein ratio. And then we had this glycogen reuptake window where people literally set stopwatches and they're trying to drink their chocolate milk in the shower. Is that still solid science about glycogen reuptake, and what's the ideal recovery drink look like?
So again, the ideal recovery drink really depends on the session demands. So, you're going and doing a strength training session for 45 minutes at a moderate intensity. You're doing an hour spin, versus, a stage of the Tour de France this year. Those recovery solutions look very different, and they're going to be very different for the individual basis. But I think there's typically, let's say, there is ways you can quantify it. Now we're quantifying it in Hexus and starting to understand what was the actual cost, how can we distribute it, what does this recovery period look like, but also some good rules for everyone as well. I think if you're looking and struggling to hit that protein intake throughout the course of the day, I think it's always good to consume a serving of protein in that post-training window.
That won't slow down your absorption of carbohydrates.
No, you're like, if anything, it's going to help the uptake of carbohydrate and sort of accelerate that recovery process. In terms of the 4-to-1 ratio, it really depends on how much you've depleted, and also not just what's happened, but what are you also trying to prepare for? So I might not have done that much work today, but actually maybe I'm starting a race tomorrow.
Yeah.
And actually I should be looking at topping up my glycogen stores to prepare for that. So I would look at it in those contexts. And in many ways, I'd always look at, what you should intake over a 72-hour window. There's, what am I doing today? What am I recovering from yesterday? And what am I preparing for tomorrow? And if we look at let's say the recovery drink, that's just one of, I don't know, it could be 12 to 15 meals, 12 to 20 meals across that process. And you'd start to factor it in around those. But I think general rules of thumb, if somebody's going out for long, intense rides, they're going to need some carbohydrate and some protein after. If it's lower intensity and it's shorter duration, some protein might be good to help just make sure you're hitting your daily protein targets.
A quick word from today's sponsor. A few years ago, I came out of my local coffee shop after a long winter spin to find my Cafe Lock on the ground, sliced clean in half. My pride and joy bike, it was gone. Just like that, a small fortune in kit, and frankly, part of my identity as a cyclist, it disappeared in seconds. If you've ever had that sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, even imagining your bike getting stolen, wrecked or damaged mid-travel, it's not just a possession. It's your freedom. It's your fitness. It's your sanity on tough weeks. That's where BIKMO comes in. Whether it's theft, damage, crashes, racing or travel, BIKMO's got your back. Their in-house claims team makes the process fast and painless. And here's the kicker. With 50% off multi-bike cover, you can protect all your bikes and even your family or your mate's bike under the same policy. No nonsense, no surprises. But BIKMO isn't just about covering bikes. They actually care about the future of cycling itself, and that's why I've partnered with them. If you insure your bike with BIKMO today, they'll donate £10 toward trash-free trails to help clean up and protect our shared cycling spaces. So head on over to BIKMO, BIKMO.com and use the code ROADMAN to get covered, save money and support our wild spaces. All that information is in the description below.